There is a moment in almost every person's life when they realize that the world runs on invisible rules. You walk into a coffee shop and wonder why a latte costs $4 in one neighborhood and $8 in another. You hear the news about inflation and feel a strange mix of confusion and anxiety because you know prices are rising but you cannot explain why. You see a politician promise free healthcare and you sense that something about the math does not quite add up, but you lack the vocabulary to articulate exactly what is wrong. That moment of awareness, that sudden itch to understand the machinery behind everyday life, is exactly where Gregory Mankiw's Principles of Economics begins. This book is not merely an academic textbook wrapped in stiff covers and sold for an absurd price at your campus bookstore. It is a lens. It is a way of seeing the world that transforms ordinary observations into extraordinary insights. When you finish reading it, you will never look at a price tag, a government policy, or even your own daily choices the same way again. Let me take you back to when this book was first born into the world, because understanding its origin story changes everything about how you should read it. Gregory Mankiw wrote this book in the mid-1990s, and the context matters enormously. The early 90s in America were a period of economic turbulence. The country had just emerged from a recession. The savings and loan crisis was still fresh in people's minds. There was a growing sense that the average citizen had lost the ability to understand the economy, that economists had retreated into mathematical fortresses speaking in equations that made no sense to regular human beings. Mankiw, who was then a young professor at Harvard, saw this gap and decided to close it. He wanted to write a book that was rigorous enough to be taken seriously by academics but accessible enough to be understood by a smart high school student. The result was a textbook that would go on to become the best-selling economics textbook in the history of the world, a book that has sold over 8 million copies and has been adopted by more universities than any other economics text. What makes this particularly remarkable is that Mankiw was not just a classroom teacher, he was a practitioner. He had served as chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors under President George W. Bush. He was a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research, one of the most prestigious economic research organizations in the United States. This meant he understood both the theory and the practice, both the classroom and the corridors of power where economic decisions are actually made. The book is structured in a deliberate and elegant way that mirrors how economists actually think about problems. It is divided into two massive parts. The first part covers microeconomics, which is the study of how individual people and businesses make decisions and how those decisions interact in markets. The second part covers macroeconomics, which is the study of the economy as a whole, looking at big-picture phenomena like economic growth, unemployment, inflation, and the role of government. This division is not arbitrary. It reflects a fundamental truth about how economics works. You cannot understand the forest if you do not understand the trees. Macro phenomena emerge from micro decisions. When you understand how a single consumer decides to buy or not buy a product, you begin to understand why entire industries boom or bust. When you understand how a single firm decides to hire or fire workers, you begin to understand why unemployment rates rise and fall. Mankiw builds the entire edifice from the ground up, starting with the simplest possible idea and layering complexity on top of it until you are looking at the full picture of how a modern economy functions. Let me start with the 10 principles that form the foundation of everything in this book, because these 10 ideas are the DNA of all economic thinking and they appear in the very first chapter. The first principle is that people face trade-offs. This sounds simple but it is profoundly important. There is no such thing as a free lunch in economics because every choice requires giving something up. When you decide to spend an hour watching a movie, you are giving up the hour you could have spent studying, exercising, or working. When a government decides to spend money on defense, it has less money to spend on education or infrastructure. The famous phrase that captures this is guns and butter, referring to the trade-off between military spending and civilian goods. This principle destroys the illusion that we can have everything we want, and that is actually a good thing because it forces us to think clearly about what we truly value. The second principle is that the cost of something is what you give up to get it. This is the concept of opportunity cost, and it is perhaps the single most powerful idea in all of economics. When you go to college, the cost is not just tuition and books. The real cost is the wages you could have earned if you had worked instead of studying. Mankiw illustrates this with a stunning example. He asks you to calculate the opportunity cost of getting a parking pass at a university where spaces are limited. If you could sell that parking pass to another student for $200, then the true cost of using the pass is not zero, it is $200. Because by using it yourself you are giving up the money you could have made by selling it. This reframes how you think about every decision in your life. Nothing is free, and understanding what you are truly giving up changes the calculus of every choice you make. The third principle is that rational people think at the margin. This is where economics becomes truly fascinating because it introduces the idea that most decisions are not black and white. You do not decide whether to study or not study. You decide whether to study one more hour or not. You do not decide whether to eat or not eat. You decide whether to eat one more slice of pizza. Economists call these marginal changes, and rational people make decisions by comparing the marginal benefit to the marginal cost. The marginal benefit is the additional benefit from one more unit of an activity. The marginal cost is the additional cost. When the marginal benefit exceeds the marginal cost, you should do more of that activity. When the marginal cost exceeds the marginal benefit, you should do less. This is why an airline will sometimes sell a last-minute seat for a very low price even though the flight is not full. The marginal cost of putting one more passenger on an already flying plane is almost zero, so any price above that zero cost is pure profit. This principle of marginal thinking applies to everything from your workout routine to your business decisions to national defense spending. The fourth principle is that people respond to incentives. This is the principle that makes economics feel almost like psychology. Incentives are what make people do things, and when you change the incentives, you change behavior. Mankiw gives the classic example of seatbelt laws. When seatbelt laws were first introduced, many people argued that they would make people drive more recklessly because they felt safer, and they were right. The incentive structure changed, the cost of reckless driving went down because the consequence of an accident became less severe, so people drove more recklessly. This is called the offset effect, and it appears everywhere in economics. When you tax something, people do more of the opposite. When you subsidize something, people do more of it. Understanding incentives is like having X-ray vision into human behavior because it reveals the hidden forces that drive every decision. The fifth principle is that trade can make everyone better off. This is one of the most counterintuitive ideas in all of economics, and Mankiw explains it with remarkable clarity. Most people think of trade as a zero-sum game where one person wins and another person loses, but economics shows that trade is positive sum, meaning both sides can gain. The reason is comparative advantage, a concept originally developed by David Ricardo in the early 1800s. Imagine two people, Alice and Bob. Alice is a better cook than Bob. Bob is a better cleaner than Alice. Even if Alice is better at everything, both of them are better off if Alice specializes in cooking and Bob specializes in cleaning, and then they trade. Alice can cook more meals in less time than if she also spent time cleaning, and Bob can clean more thoroughly in less time than if he also spent time cooking. The same logic applies to countries. Japan is more efficient at producing electronics than Brazil. Brazil is more efficient at producing coffee than Japan. When they trade, both countries end up with more electronics and more coffee than if they tried to produce everything themselves. This principle is the intellectual foundation for free trade, and it is also the reason why protectionist policies always end up making everyone poorer in the long run. The sixth principle is that markets are usually a good way to organize economic activity. This is the invisible hand principle that Adam Smith introduced over 200 years ago, and Mankiw spends considerable time explaining why it works. In a market economy, millions of buyers and sellers interact without any central planner telling them what to do. The prices that emerge from this interaction carry all the information needed for the economy to coordinate itself. If there is a shortage of a product, the price rises, which signals producers to make more and consumers to buy less. If there is a surplus, the price falls, which signals producers to make less and consumers to buy more. This self-correcting mechanism is astonishingly efficient, and it works without anyone needing to understand how the entire system functions. The single consumer does not need to know how many apples are being grown in Washington state or how many oranges are being harvested in Florida. The price system handles all of that information automatically. The seventh principle is that governments can sometimes improve market outcomes. This is where Mankiw shows his balanced approach. He is not an ideological purist who believes markets can do everything. He acknowledges that markets can fail in important ways. The first type of market failure is when the market outcome is inefficient because a good market does not exist at all. This happens with public goods, which are goods that are non-excludable and non-rivalrous. A lighthouse is the classic example. Once a lighthouse is built, every ship can benefit from its light, and one ship using the light does not reduce its availability to other ships. No private company can charge individual ships for using the light, so the market will not build one. The government must step in and provide it. The second type of market failure is when the market outcome is inefficient because of externalities, which are the costs or benefits that affect someone who did not choose to incur them. When a factory pollutes a river, the people downstream bear the cost of that pollution even though they had nothing to do with the factory's decision. When you get a vaccination, you not only protect yourself but also reduce the spread of disease to others, creating a positive externality. In both cases, the market outcome is not efficient because the full social costs or benefits are not reflected in the market price. Government intervention, whether through regulation or taxation or subsidies, can sometimes correct these failures. The eighth principle is that productivity is the primary determinant of living standards. This principle connects the micro world of individual firms to the macro world of nations. Mankiw explains that the standard of living in a country depends almost entirely on how productive its workers are. A country where workers can produce more goods and services per hour of work will be richer than a country where workers produce less. This is why the difference in living standards between countries is so enormous. The United States has a per capita income that is many times higher than that of the poorest countries in the world, and the reason is not culture or geography or climate. It is productivity. American workers produce far more per hour than workers in poor countries, and that difference compounds over time into a vast gap in living standards. This principle has enormous policy implications because it means that the most important thing a government can do to improve living standards is to create the conditions that allow productivity to grow. The ninth principle is that governments can print money but they cannot print prosperity. This is Mankiw's way of explaining inflation, and it is one of the most important lessons in all of macroeconomics. When a government prints too much money, the value of each dollar falls, and prices rise. This is not a theory, it is a historical fact that has been repeated thousands of times across centuries and continents. Germany in the 1920s is the most famous example, where people needed Wheelbarrows full of cash to buy a loaf of bread. Zimbabwe in the 2000s experienced hyperinflation where prices doubled every day. Venezuela in recent years has experienced one of the worst inflation crises in modern history. The lesson is simple and brutal. If a government finances its spending by printing money, it will eventually destroy the value of its currency. There is no way around this fundamental truth, and it is why central banks around the world are designed to be independent from political pressure. The 10th and final principle is that society can face a short-run trade-off between inflation and unemployment. This is the Phillips curve, and it represents one of the most debated ideas in all of economics. In the short run, when the government increases the money supply, it can lower unemployment by stimulating demand, but it does so at the cost of higher inflation. In the long run, however, there is no such trade-off. Money is neutral, meaning that changes in the money supply affect nominal variables like prices and wages but not real variables like unemployment and output. This principle is crucial because it explains why policymakers face difficult choices and why some policies that seem good in the short run can be disastrous in the long run. Now let me move into the heart of the microeconomics section, starting with supply and demand, which is the single most important tool in the entire economics toolkit. Mankiw introduces supply and demand in a way that is both simple and deeply powerful. He starts with the demand curve, which shows the relationship between the price of a good and the quantity that consumers are willing and able to buy. The law of demand is straightforward. When the price of a good rises, the quantity demanded falls, and when the price falls, the quantity demanded rises. This is represented by a downward-sloping demand curve, but Mankiw goes deeper. He explains why the demand curve slopes downward, and he does it through two effects. The substitution effect says that when a good becomes more expensive, consumers substitute away from it toward other goods. The income effect says that when a good becomes more expensive, consumers feel poorer and buy less of it. These two effects work together to create the downward slope, and understanding them helps you predict how consumers will respond to price changes in very specific ways. The supply curve slopes upward because of the law of supply, which states that when the price of a good rises, the quantity supplied rises. Mankiw explains this through the cost of production. When the price of a good rises, it becomes more profitable to produce it, so firms increase production. But he also introduces the important distinction between a change in quantity supplied and a change in supply. A change in quantity supplied is a movement along the supply curve caused by a change in price. A change in supply is a shift of the entire curve caused by something other than price, like a change in technology or the cost of inputs. This distinction is critical because most people confuse the two, and confusing them leads to fundamentally wrong conclusions about how markets work. When supply and demand come together, they determine the equilibrium price and quantity. The equilibrium is the point where the quantity demanded equals the quantity supplied, and it is where the market naturally settles. Mankiw illustrates this with a powerful example. Imagine the market for gasoline. If the price is above equilibrium, there is a surplus, meaning more gasoline is being produced than consumers want to buy. Producers will lower their prices to sell the excess, and as the price falls, quantity demanded rises and quantity supplied falls until equilibrium is restored. If the price is below equilibrium, there is a shortage, meaning consumers want to buy more than producers are willing to sell. Consumers will bid up the price, and as the price rises, quantity demanded falls and quantity supplied rises until equilibrium is restored. This self-correcting mechanism is why markets are so powerful, and it is why government interventions like price ceilings and price floors often create more problems than they solve. Elasticity is the next major concept, and it measures how responsive buyers and sellers are to changes in market conditions. Price elasticity of demand measures how much the quantity demanded responds to a change in price. If demand is elastic, a small change in price leads to a large change in quantity demanded. If demand is inelastic, a large change in price leads to a small change in quantity demanded. Mankiw explains that the key determinant of elasticity is the availability of close substitutes. If a good has many close substitutes, consumers can easily switch to another good when the price rises. So demand is elastic. If a good has no close substitutes, consumers have no choice but to pay the higher price, so demand is inelastic. This is why demand for insulin is highly inelastic. Diabetics need insulin to survive, and there are no good substitutes. A large increase in the price of insulin will not significantly reduce the quantity demanded, which is why insulin is one of the most controversial pricing issues in American healthcare. The concept of consumer surplus is one of the most beautiful ideas in economics, and Mankiw explains it with elegant simplicity. Consumer surplus is the difference between what a consumer is willing to pay for a good and what they actually pay. Imagine you are willing to pay $50 for a pair of shoes, but you find them on sale for $30. Your consumer surplus is $20. When you add up the consumer surplus of every buyer in the market, you get the total consumer surplus, which is a measure of the total benefit that buyers receive from participating in the market. Producer surplus is the mirror image. It is the difference between what a producer is willing to accept for a good and what they actually receive. When you add up both consumer surplus and producer surplus, you get total surplus, which is a measure of the total benefit that society receives from market transactions. This is the foundation of the argument for free markets, because Mankiw shows that when markets are competitive and efficient, total surplus is maximized. Mankiw then introduces the concept of efficiency, which in economics means that the market maximizes total surplus. He distinguishes efficiency from equity, which is about fairness. A market outcome can be efficient but not equitable, and vice versa. This is a crucial distinction that many people miss. The market can allocate resources in the most efficient way possible while still producing outcomes that many people consider deeply unfair. Recognizing this tension between efficiency and equity is essential for understanding why societies choose to have governments that redistribute income and provide social safety nets, even while relying on markets as the primary mechanism for allocating resources. The government can intervene in markets through taxes, and Mankiw explains the welfare effects of taxation with remarkable clarity. When the government imposes a tax on a good, it creates a wedge between the price buyers pay and the price sellers receive. This wedge reduces the quantity traded, which reduces both consumer surplus and producer surplus. But the key insight is that the loss of surplus is larger than the tax revenue the government collects. The difference between the total loss of surplus and the tax revenue is called the deadweight loss, and it represents the value of transactions that would have been mutually beneficial but are destroyed by the tax. This is why economists generally prefer taxes that create small deadweight losses, and it is why broad-based taxes like sales taxes are generally more efficient than narrow-based taxes that distort specific markets. Moving into the next major area, Mankiw discusses the economics of the public sector. Public goods are goods that are non-excludable, meaning you cannot prevent people from using them, and non-rivalrous, meaning one person's use does not reduce another's use. National defense is the quintessential public good. Once a country has a military, every citizen is protected whether they pay taxes or not, and one person's protection does not reduce the protection available to others. Because of these characteristics, public goods are typically underproduced by the market because private companies cannot charge users directly. The government must step in to provide them, funded by taxation. This is one of the clearest justifications for government intervention in the economy. Common resources are another important category. These are goods that are rivalrous but non-excludable. The ocean's fish are a common resource. Anyone can fish in the ocean, but when one person catches a fish, there is one less fish for everyone else. This leads to the tragedy of the commons, a concept popularized by Garrett Hardin, where individuals acting in their own self-interest deplete a shared resource even though it is contrary to the long-term interests of everyone. Mankiw explains how governments can address this through regulation, quotas, or by creating property rights that give individuals a stake in preserving the resource. This framework applies to everything from overfishing and deforestation to traffic congestion and spectrum allocation. Externalities are perhaps the most important concept in the public sector chapter. An externality is a cost or benefit that affects someone who is not part of the transaction. Pollution is a negative externality. When a factory produces steel, it pollutes the air, and the people living nearby bear the cost of that pollution even though they are not part of the steel market. The market produces too much steel because the producer does not bear the full social cost of production. The solution, Mankiw explains, can take several forms. The government can impose a Pigouvian tax, which is a tax on the activity that creates the negative externality. The tax forces the producer to internalize the externality, meaning the producer now bears the full social cost, and the market moves toward the efficient outcome. Alternatively, the government can use command and control regulation, setting limits on the amount of pollution. Or the government can use market-based solutions like tradable pollution permits, where firms can buy and sell the right to pollute, creating a market incentive to reduce emissions in the cheapest way possible. The concept of property rights is fundamental to how markets function, and Mankiw devotes significant attention to it. When property rights are well defined and enforced, markets can solve many problems through negotiation. This is the Coase theorem, named after economist Ronald Coase, who showed that if property rights are clearly defined and transaction costs are low, private parties can solve externality problems through bargaining without any government intervention. The classic example is a rancher and a farmer. If the rancher's cattle damage the farmer's crops, the efficient outcome can be reached through negotiation regardless of who has the legal right, as long as transaction costs are low. But when transaction costs are high, as they often are in the real world, government intervention becomes necessary. Now let me shift to the macroeconomics section, which is where Mankiw's book becomes truly powerful. The first major topic is how economists measure the health of an economy, and the central measure is gross domestic product, or GDP. GDP is the market value of all final goods and services produced within a country in a given period of time. Mankiw breaks this down carefully, explaining that GDP includes only final goods to avoid double counting. If a bakery buys flour from a mill and then uses that flour to make bread, only the bread counts in GDP, not the flour. Including the flour would be counting the same value twice. He also explains the three ways to measure GDP, which should all give the same result. You can measure it by adding up all the spending on final goods and services, which is the expenditure approach. You can measure it by adding up all the income earned by factors of production, which is the income approach. Or you can measure it by adding up the value added at each stage of production, which is the value added approach. These three approaches are different ways of looking at the same thing, like looking at a cube from three different angles. Real GDP versus nominal GDP is a crucial distinction, and Mankiw explains it with examples that make it stick. Nominal GDP is measured in current prices, so it can rise because prices rise or because output rises. Real GDP is measured in constant prices, so it only rises when output rises. The difference between nominal and real GDP is captured by the GDP deflator, which is a measure of the overall price level. If nominal GDP rises by 10% and real GDP rises by 3%, then the GDP deflator has risen by approximately 7%, which means inflation has been running at about 7%. This distinction is essential for understanding whether an economy is actually growing or whether it is just getting more expensive. The Consumer Price Index is another important measure of the price level, and Mankiw explains how it is constructed and what its limitations are. The CPI measures the cost of a fixed basket of goods and services that a typical consumer buys. It is calculated by taking the cost of the basket in the current year and dividing it by the cost of the basket in a base year, then multiplying by 100. The problem with the CPI is that it can overstate inflation because it does not fully account for changes in consumer behavior. When the price of a good rises, consumers substitute away from that good toward cheaper alternatives, but the CPI basket is fixed and does not capture the substitution. This is called substitution bias, and it means the CPI tends to overstate the true increase in the cost of living. Other biases include the introduction of new goods and unmeasured quality changes. These biases are small but important, and they matter enormously when the CPI is used to index social security payments or when it is cited in political debates about the cost of living. Unemployment is the next major macroeconomic topic, and Mankiw breaks it down into three types. Frictional unemployment is the unemployment that results from the time it takes for workers to search for jobs that match their skills. This is inevitable and even desirable because it allows workers to find jobs where they are most productive. Structural unemployment is the unemployment that results from a mismatch between the skills workers have and the skills employers need. This can happen because of technological change, international competition, or the rise of minimum wage laws. Cyclical unemployment is the unemployment that results from bad times in the business cycle, when the demand for goods and services falls and firms lay off workers. Understanding these three types of unemployment is crucial because the policy responses are very different. Frictional unemployment is a normal part of a healthy labor market. Structural unemployment requires education and training programs. Cyclical unemployment requires macroeconomic policy to stimulate demand. The savings and investment chapter is where Mankiw connects the financial system to the real economy. Financial markets are the mechanisms through which people who want to save can lend to people who want to borrow. Stocks and bonds are the two most important financial instruments. A stock represents ownership in a company, while a bond represents a loan to a company or government. Financial intermediaries like banks also play a crucial role by collecting deposits from savers and making loans to borrowers. Mankiw explains the loanable funds market, which is the market where savers supply funds and borrowers demand funds. The interest rate is the price in this market, and it adjusts to balance savings and investment. When the government runs a budget deficit, it borrows from the loanable funds market, which reduces the supply of funds available for private investment. This is called crowding out, and it is one of the most important mechanisms through which government borrowing can harm long-run economic growth. The productivity and growth chapter is where Mankiw tackles the most important question in all of economics, which is why some countries are rich and others are poor. The answer, as he explains, is productivity, and productivity depends on four things: physical capital, which is the stock of equipment and structures used to produce goods and services; human capital, which is the knowledge and skills that workers acquire through education and experience; natural resources, which are the inputs into production that are provided by nature, like land and minerals; and technological knowledge, which is the understanding of the best ways to produce goods and services. Mankiw emphasizes that technological knowledge is not the same as technological progress. Technological knowledge is what we know about how to produce things. Technological progress is the discovery of new and better ways to produce things. Economic growth is driven primarily by technological progress, which is why countries that invest in research and development and education tend to grow faster than countries that do not. The inflation chapter is where Mankiw explains one of the most important relationships in macroeconomics, which is the quantity theory of money. This theory states that the quantity of money available in an economy determines the level of prices in that economy. The equation that captures this is MV equals PY, where M is the money supply, V is the velocity of money, P is the price level, and Y is real output. If V and Y are relatively stable in the short run, then changes in M lead to proportional changes in P. This means that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, a phrase famously associated with Milton Friedman. Mankiw explains how central banks control the money supply through open market operations, where they buy and sell government bonds to increase or decrease the amount of money in the banking system. He also explains the concept of the velocity of money, which is how quickly money circulates through the economy, and how changes in velocity can complicate the relationship between money supply and inflation. The short-run trade-off between inflation and unemployment is explored in depth, and Mankiw explains the Phillips curve, which shows the inverse relationship between inflation and unemployment in the short run. When unemployment is low, inflation tends to be high, and when unemployment is high, inflation tends to be low. This happens because when the economy is operating near full capacity, firms face higher costs and raise prices. When the economy is in a recession, firms have excess capacity and compete aggressively on price, which puts downward pressure on prices. But Mankiw emphasizes that this trade-off only exists in the short run, i.e. in the long run. The Phillips curve is vertical, meaning that there is no trade-off between inflation and unemployment. The long-run unemployment rate is determined by structural factors like labor market institutions and the natural rate of unemployment, not by the inflation rate. This is a crucial insight because it means that policies designed to reduce unemployment below its natural rate through inflation will only work temporarily, and in the long run they will result in higher inflation without any lasting reduction in unemployment. The Open Economy chapter is where Mankiw introduces the concept of net exports and the exchange rate. Net exports are the value of a country's exports minus the value of its imports. When a country exports more than it imports, it has a trade surplus. When it imports more than it exports, it has a trade deficit. The exchange rate is the rate at which one currency can be exchanged for another, and it is determined by the supply and demand for currencies in foreign exchange markets. Mankiw explains that when a country saves less than it invests, it must borrow from abroad, which means it runs a trade deficit. This is because national saving minus investment equals net exports, so if saving is less than investment, net exports must be negative. This is a profound insight that connects the domestic savings and investment decision to the international trade balance, and it explains why countries like the United States, which have low savings rates, tend to run persistent trade deficits. The business cycle chapter is where Mankiw explains the fluctuations in economic activity that characterize modern economies. The business cycle has 4 phases: expansion, peak, contraction, and trough. During an expansion, output and employment rise. During a peak, the economy reaches its highest point before starting to decline. During a contraction, output and employment fall. During a trough, the economy reaches its lowest point before starting to recover. Mankiw explains that business cycles are unpredictable and irregular, which makes them difficult to manage. He also distinguishes between demand shocks, which affect the demand for goods and services, and supply shocks, which affect the cost of production. A negative demand shock, like a decline in consumer confidence, reduces output and employment. A negative supply shock, like an oil price increase, reduces output and raises prices, creating stagflation, which is a combination of stagnation and inflation. The fiscal policy chapter is where Mankiw discusses how government spending and taxation can be used to influence the economy. Expansionary fiscal policy involves increasing government spending or decreasing taxes to stimulate aggregate demand. Contractionary fiscal policy involves decreasing government spending or increasing taxes to reduce aggregate demand. Mankiw explains the multiplier effect, which is the idea that an initial change in spending leads to a larger change in overall economic activity. When the government spends $1, that dollar becomes income for someone, who then spends a portion of it, which becomes income for someone else, and so on. The total increase in economic activity is a multiple of the initial spending. The size of the multiplier depends on the marginal propensity to consume, which is the fraction of additional income that households spend rather than save. A higher marginal propensity to consume means a larger multiplier. The monetary policy chapter is where Mankiw explains how central banks use the tools of monetary policy to influence the economy. The Federal Reserve, which is the central bank of the United States, uses 3 main tools: open market operations, where the Fed buys or sells government bonds to influence the money supply; the discount rate, which is the interest rate the Fed charges on loans to banks; and reserve requirements, which are the rules that determine how much money banks must hold in reserve rather than lending out. Mankiw explains that the Fed's primary tool is open market operations, and that it conducts these operations through the Federal Open Market Committee, which meets regularly to decide on monetary policy. He also explains the concept of the federal funds rate, which is the interest rate that banks charge each other for overnight loans, and how the Fed targets this rate to influence broader interest rates and economic activity. The final chapter brings everything together, and Mankiw discusses the long-run determinants of living standards and the short-run determinants of economic fluctuations. In the long run, living standards are determined by productivity, which depends on physical capital, human capital, natural resources, and technological knowledge. In the short run, economic fluctuations are driven by changes in aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Mankiw emphasizes that while the short run is important for understanding recessions and recoveries, the long run is what ultimately matters for the well-being of a nation's citizens. Policies that promote productivity growth, like investment in education and research, will have far greater effects on living standards than policies that try to manage the business cycle, although both are important. Now let me talk about the reception of this book, because the praise it has received is extraordinary and tells us something important about why it has been so influential. Mankiw's Principles of Economics has been reviewed by virtually every major publication, and the reviews are uniformly positive. The Wall Street Journal called it the gold standard of introductory economics textbooks. The New York Times praised its clarity and accessibility, noting that Mankiw has the rare gift of making complex ideas feel simple without making them feel shallow. The Economist called it the most successful economics textbook ever written, and it is hard to argue with that assessment given its sales figures and its dominance in university classrooms around the world. What readers consistently praise is Mankiw's ability to connect economic theory to real-world issues. He does not present economics as an abstract mathematical exercise, he presents it as a way of thinking about the world, and he illustrates every concept with examples that are relevant to students' lives. When he explains supply and demand, he uses examples like the market for college education and the market for housing. When he explains externalities, he uses examples like pollution and traffic. Congestion. When he explains monetary policy, he uses examples like the Federal Reserve's response to the 2008 financial crisis. These examples make the theory come alive, and they help students see that economics is not just a subject to be studied but a tool to be used. Another thing that readers consistently praise is the book's organization and pedagogy. Each chapter begins with a story or a puzzle that illustrates the key concepts, and each chapter ends with a summary and a set of questions that test understanding. The book includes numerous in-text examples that walk through specific applications of the concepts, and it includes real-world examples that show how the concepts apply to current events. This pedagogical structure makes the book accessible to students at all levels, from high school students taking an introductory course to college students majoring in economics. The book has also been praised for its balance. Mankiw is known for his market-oriented perspective, and he does not shy away from presenting the case for free markets and limited government. But he is also honest about the limitations of markets and the potential role for government intervention. He presents both sides of every debate, and he lets students draw their own conclusions. This balance has earned him respect from economists across the political spectrum, even though some on the left have criticized him for being too sympathetic to free market ideas, and some on the right have criticized him for being too sympathetic to government intervention. Let me now discuss the specific chapters that are considered the most important in the book, because these are the chapters that students and instructors return to again and again. Chapter 1, which contains the 10 principles, is the most important chapter in the entire book. IT is the foundation on which everything else is built, and it is the chapter that students should read most carefully. Chapter 4, which covers supply and demand, is the second most important chapter because supply and demand is the single most important tool in all of economics. Chapter 5, which covers elasticity, is crucial because it provides the quantitative framework for understanding how responsive markets are to changes in conditions. Chapter 7, which covers the government and the market, is important because it introduces the concepts of efficiency and equity and the reasons why government intervention may be necessary. Chapter 10, which covers the costs of production, is important because it introduces the firm's decision-making framework. Firms make decisions about how much to produce based on the relationship between cost and revenue, and understanding this relationship is essential for understanding how markets work. Chapter 11, which covers the firms in competitive markets, is important because it shows how competitive markets lead to efficient outcomes. Chapter 13, which covers the costs of taxation and the benefits of free trade, is important because it quantifies the welfare effects of government intervention and the gains from trade. Chapter 14, which covers the economics of public sectors, is important because it explains the role of government in addressing market failures. Chapter 20, which covers the measurement of a nation's income, is important because it introduces GDP and the other key measures of economic performance. Chapter 21, which covers the cost of living, is important because it explains how inflation is measured and why it matters. Chapter 22, which covers the financial system, is important because it explains how savings are channeled into investment and how financial markets support economic growth. Chapter 23, which covers saving, investment, and the financial system, is important because it connects the financial system to the real economy through the loanable funds market. Chapter 24, which covers the cost of unemployment and the benefits of economic growth, is important because it explains why economic growth is the most important goal of economic policy. Chapter 25, which covers the short-run trade-off between inflation and unemployment, is important because it introduces the Phillips curve and the short-run dynamics of macroeconomic policy. Chapter 26, which covers monetary policy, is important because it explains how central banks influence the economy through the control of money and credit. Chapter 27, which covers fiscal policy, is important because it explains how government spending and taxation influence the economy. Chapter 28, which covers open economy macroeconomics, is important because it connects the domestic economy to the global economy through trade and financial flows. What makes Mankiw's book truly special is not just the content but the way the content is presented. Mankiw writes with a clarity and warmth that is rare in academic textbooks. He does not talk down to his readers, but he also does not overwhelm them with unnecessary complexity. He finds the right balance between rigor and accessibility, and he illustrates every abstract concept with a concrete example that makes it memorable. When he explains the concept of comparative advantage, he uses the example of a lawyer who is better at typing than her secretary. The lawyer should not type her own documents, even though she is better at it, because her opportunity cost of typing is higher than her secretary's. This example is so vivid that it stays with you long after you have finished the chapter. When he explains the concept of deadweight loss, he uses the example of a tax on pizza. The tax reduces the quantity of pizza sold, and the reduction in sales destroys some of the surplus that would have been created by the transactions that no longer occur. This deadweight loss is the value of the lost transactions, and it is a cost of taxation that goes beyond the revenue collected by the government. This example makes an abstract concept feel concrete and real, and it helps students understand why economists are generally concerned about the efficiency costs of taxation. When he explains the concept of the multiplier, he uses the example of the government building a bridge. The government spends money on the bridge, which becomes income for construction workers, who then spend that income at local businesses, which becomes income for the owners of those businesses, and so on. The total increase in economic activity is a multiple of the initial government spending, and the size of the multiple depends on how much of each dollar of income is spent rather than saved. This example makes the multiplier effect feel intuitive, and it helps students understand why fiscal policy can have such large effects on the economy. The book has also been praised for its relevance to current events. Mankiw regularly updates the book to include new examples and to reflect changes in economic policy and economic conditions. The most recent editions include discussions of the 2008 financial crisis, the Great Recession, the quantitative easing policies of the Federal Reserve, the tax reform legislation of 2017, and the economic responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. This ongoing relevance is one of the reasons why the book has remained the dominant economics textbook for so many editions and so many years. One of the most powerful aspects of the book is how it changes the way you think about policy debates. When you hear a politician argue for a policy, you can now ask the right questions. Is this policy efficient? Does it maximize total surplus? Is it equitable? Who gains and who loses? What are the incentives created by this policy? What are the long-run effects versus the short-run effects? These are the questions that an economics education teaches you to ask, and Mankiw's book is the best introduction to these questions that exists. The book also teaches you to think about your own life differently. When you make a decision, you can now think about the opportunity cost. When you evaluate a policy, you can now think about the incentives. When you hear about a trade agreement, you can now think about comparative advantage. When you hear about a tax proposal, you can now think about deadweight loss. When you hear about a government program, you can now think about market failures and the trade-off between efficiency and equity. These are the tools that economics gives you, and Mankiw's book is the best guide to acquiring these tools. What is remarkable about Mankiw's approach is that he never pretends to have all the answers. He presents the evidence, he explains the theories, he discusses the debates, and he lets the reader decide. This is the hallmark of good teaching, and it is what makes this book so valuable. IT does not indoctrinate, IT educates, IT does not tell you what to think, IT teaches you how to think. And in a world where information is abundant but wisdom is scarce, that is an invaluable skill. The book has sold over 8 million copies worldwide, and it has been translated into dozens of languages. IT is used in universities across the globe, from Harvard to the University of Tokyo to the University of Buenos Aires. IT has been adopted by business schools, law schools, medical schools, and liberal arts colleges. IT has been recommended by Nobel laureates and criticized by ideologues, and it has endured because it is simply the best introduction to economics that has ever been written. If you want to understand the world, if you want to make better decisions, if you want to be a more informed citizen, if you want to understand the policies that shape your life, then this book is for you. IT is not a book you read once and then forget. IT is a book you return to again and again, each time discovering new insights and new connections. IT is a book that will change the way you see everything, from the price of coffee to the policies of your government to the future of the global economy. Gregory Mankiw's Principles of Economics is not just a textbook. IT is a guide to understanding the world, and it is a guide that almost everyone who has read it says changed their life.